Welcome, good evening. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here to the RCA, to the lecture theatre for Saskia Sassen tonight. This is part of the Visual Culture lecture series. And the aim of this public lecture series is to address questions relevant to our understanding of fine art and its broader context. We are truly delighted to welcome the political economist and sociologist Saskia Sassen, and her studies on urban space and globalization have a great deal to offer to us, the arts community. She recently led a debate in Art Forum on the relationship of occupation to notions of territory and power, and she's also been cited as a key thinker and contributor to the exhibition Uneven Growth, Tactical Urbanism for Expanding Megacities, which is currently on show at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. 2 days ago, she was speaking at the exhibition The Alien Within at Malmö Kunsthall, which is curated by RCA alumni and director of the Kunsthall, Diana Baldon. This evening also marks the beginning of a new tradition whereby our students will introduce the speaker and be given this platform. I'm very pleased that Maya Ngum, who is a student in the photography program, will present Saskia Sassen.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to have a chance to introduce Saskia Sassen as a guest speaker of the Visual Culture series at Royal College of Art. Saskia Sassen is the Robert Stoughton Professor of Sociology and the chair of the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University in New York. Main subjects of her research and writing are globalization, global cities, immigration, the new technologies, and transformation in the liberal state caused by current transnational conditions. Her body of work consists of many titles, to mention only a few here: The Mobility of Labor and Capital from 1988, Cities in a World Economy, 1994, Territory, Authority, Rights from Medieval to Global Assemblages from 2004. Her second book, The Global City, New York, London, Tokyo, published in 1991, constitutes one of her 3 large projects that she undertook throughout the 20 years of research, and the one in which she developed the concept of the global city. She has received diverse awards from multiple Doctor Honoris Causa in Europe and the United States of America. Furthermore, as an outstanding and influential theoretician, she was chosen as one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine annually in 2011, top 100 thought leaders by GDI and MIT in both years 2012 and 2013, and recently in 2014 considered one of the top 50 global thinkers according to Prospect magazine. In 2013, she received Príncipe de Asturias Prize for the Social Sciences, and the same year she was elected to the Royal Academy of the Sciences of the Netherlands. She has long been involved with projects outside the Academy. One of these was the 2006 Venice Biennale of Architecture, which for the first time in its history focused on cities. She also wrote a lead essay for the catalogue. Her books have been translated in more than 20 languages, most recently Arabic. And today, Sassen will present a lecture titled Systematic Edges as Spaces of Conceptual Invisibility, which is based on her latest book, Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity, published in 2014. And also, Saskia has brought some books with her here, so to view later on at the end of the lecture. And please join me in welcoming Saskia Sassen.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to talk like an audience, to an audience like you, since I really don't know very much about the arts. You probably don't know very much about what I'm going to be talking about. And so I'm already looking forward to the kinds of questions that will come in at the end. I want to take you on a bit of a trip through a whole set of processes that are, I would argue, remarking our current condition. And it's not a pretty picture. We need, I argue, to take cognizance of these transformations. And we need probably to find a vocabulary that allows us to capture these conditions on terms that are different from the familiar ones we have inherited, if you want, from a past era. So again, I really am not somebody who addresses the question of art. I barely am somebody who addresses the question of culture. So let's see what happens. Now, I want to start by thanking everybody who was involved in organizing this route, and Anna Dufau and probably several other people. Thank you, thank you. So the concept that I want to use as a navigator is that familiar conditions, familiar processes, at some point, and this is what's happening today, can take on such an extreme format that they actually become invisible to the conceptual categories that we have developed to capture these processes when they are in the shape of familiar conditions. In other words, the argument also holds, or my argument also holds, that no matter how material they are, they become invisible. And therein lies a real problematic into the notion that it can be very material and yet be invisible. We tend to think if it is material, it is visible. Now that leads me to a third, and this is truly an experimental proposition. This is probably more for an audience like this one than it would be, let's say, for a social science audience. But here I feel free to sort of put it out there, and I would be very curious to hear what you think about it. And it is the notion that we really see theoretically. If we didn't, we would go crazy. We would notice everything. We would not be able to think. That enables for very material conditions to be invisible to us. Otherwise, you would say, how can they be invisible? Now, we all know, as a simple example, a familiar example, not necessarily a simple example, a familiar example, the fact that Eskimos see many, many different types of snow that we don't, we who do not live there. So similarly with us, even smaller cultural differences, some people see certain things and others don't see them. So I think that this notion that we are profoundly theoretical beings, and think of theoria, the Greek word, it means seeing, but that also means that we don't see everything. And I repeat, in that context then, massive material conditions can become invisible. And when they are not massive, you know, it's a bit more understandable, but when they're massive, it is sort of not understandable. Now, it's not that they cease existing, they are there, but we don't see them for all kinds of reasons. One of those reasons, I repeat, is this notion that we see theoretically. Sort of a distilling. Now, the kind of work that I do requires, which is not your standard social science, and maybe that is why I am invited to speak here. Ruth, you will tell me afterwards if that's the case. But anyhow, is something that requires, and I have come to understand that expose, a space that I call the space before method. In the social sciences, method is a deeply disciplining condition. It sort of gives you little wiggle room. I find that at a time when stabilized meanings become unstable because of transformations, etc., and this is one such period, we actually find ourselves confronting the necessity, I would argue, to take those existing categories carefully, to ask, a few questions. So one way of putting it, to interrogate those categories, I'll come back to that. So one way of putting it is that my place for doing research is in the fuzzy edges of paradigmatic knowledges. I don't reject the paradigm, the core, the strong core. But that's not my zone. It's in those edges. And the hypothesis is that at those fuzzy edges, you can actually see something that is unstable, that is not fully visible if you use the traditional categories. And so out of that then comes also this notion of expulsions, which is what I want to focus a lot on tonight, but there are other moments that fit in there as well that don't necessarily relate to expulsions. So expulsions is what I want to speak about tonight, I repeat. Now, one way of thinking about this mode of operating is as analytic tactics. This is truly before method. And I would be very curious to understand if you, in your artistic practice, etc., also have sort of the notion of tactical moves, not the final product, not the final making, not the final vision, but sort of tactical movements vis-a-vis whatever the question, whatever the object, that you are working with. Now, here are a few of these analytic tactics in my practice. So the first one is the necessity to actively destabilize stable meanings. No powerful meaning is stable forever, but they can acquire a certain type of stability, and then they function. The middle classes, the economy, the state. Today, they were fairly stable meanings for quite a few decades after World War II in the West. I argue that over the last 30 years, over the last 20 years, in some parts of the world, they have become unstable. But I add to that the need to actively destabilize those categories. Now, again, I invite you to think what might be such categories in your own work, that you are dealing with. To what extent is this active destabilizing an interesting sort of heuristic that you can adopt? The second one is, one way of putting it is, what don't I see when I invoke a powerful category? So a powerful category cannot easily be thrown out. You can't just say, I don't like it. You've got to deal with it. But what you can do is you can interrogate it. You can say, if I say the state, what don't I see? Now, again, in your world, the equivalent terms would be different. And so I think of that as sort of the practice of going into the shadows around the light that a powerful category produces. The stronger that light, the more difficult it is to understand what is in the penumbra around that circle of light. I mean, think of the standard images, of course. Dark street, one light, circle of light. The more you can see inside that circle of light, in other words, the more powerful the category is, the more difficult it is to see what lies in the shadows around it. And if it is a powerful category, it means that it has eliminated all kinds of items. Otherwise, it's not powerful category, otherwise it's a description. So the question is, the stronger the heart of a category, the more we need to interrogate what don't I see, when I call it forth. Finally, I'm going to skip the territory bit. That's sort of that is a huge subject for me, and it runs through my presentation tonight as well. But the notion is to really destabilize the category, to make it work analytically. Right now, it has one singular meaning, and no matter how complex that meaning might be, national sovereign territory, it has one meaning. It is not working analytically. It's sort of taking an analytic siesta. That's all it's doing. So I want to argue, for instance, that territory can be nomadic, institutionally speaking. It doesn't have to be fixed. But I'll skip that. And then finally go to the notion of the making of it all. I am interested at this stage in looking at the making of things. That is a partial approach, because there are inherited genealogies of meaning, there are mimetic conditions. So when I say I'm going to use as my flashlight the making of a condition, I am ipso facto saying I'm going to take a partial perspective. But I think that emphasizing the making becomes interesting at a time when, again, existing categories are becoming unstable, are becoming weak, and when we need to remake a lot of our political economies, a lot of, you know, the stuff that constitutes, if you want, our society. Now, we make this. Oopsie, can we make this work or not? Does this work? Do you see? So this is just a curve. I love these one-line curves. They have narrative power, these lines. This is the making of internally displaced people. Now, again, that's to say we make that is very and the we is always an ambiguous condition, clearly. It's an ambiguous perspective, but it gets at something. It says this is not just something that's there, it exists. And we make these environmental destructions. Look at this. This is, you know this, right? The RLC. This is what it was 20 years ago. Now it's reduced to this sliver of water. I stand back and I say, formidable. We made that. That took some doing to reduce this catastrophic reduction. So to emphasize this notion of making is a way of dramatizing something as well. Now, clearly, the we make, you know, it's an ambiguous, but it is a way, it's a rhetoric device. We made this. Again, quite extraordinary how we managed to eliminate this huge amount of ice, etc., etc. So that is a bit this notion of emphasizing the making. Now, let me take as a framing for the next part a question. And the question is, if I look at our contemporary epoch, and we can confine ourselves to familiar ground, the West, whatever we may want to call it, what is the steam engine today that organizes this current period, this epoch that really begins to take shape almost 30 years ago, but now is in its fullness? We see it for what it is a bit, with all the shortcomings, all the bad stuff. So when I ask that question, when I have a small audience like here, I'm always tempted to ask you, what do you think is the steam engine of our epoch? Anybody? Don't you have an idea? Internet. And what, anybody disagrees with that? Nobody disagrees? Well, that... Globalization. Pardon? Well, globalization, right, that is... But I think that most people say information, you know, technologies or digitization or the internet, etc. And I think there is a truth to that. It is present everywhere, directly and indirectly. But I like to argue partly as a contestation, partly to get at the deep dynamic in our current period that is so complex that people like to stay away from it. So I argue, no. It's not information technology. But again, it's partly provocation, and it's partly sort of to shape. I say it's finance. Not really finance as much as financialization. And here I should really make a distinction, which is that finance is not banking. We all need traditional banking. We all need to get a loan at some point or another to take the next move. So nothing wrong with traditional banks. That's not the point here. Finance is a sector, incredibly powerful, incredibly smart, that sells something it does not have. So unlike the traditional banks, which sells money it has and charges you an interest, that's the price, finance sells something it does not have. And in that selling what it does not have lies both its innovative character, its complexity of instrument making, you know. And why? Because it has to invade other sectors. But that is also why it is dangerous. Did you follow that? Did you follow what I just said? In other words, it's complex, it's dangerous because it needs to invade other sectors. It's complex because it needs to make the instruments to invade other sectors. Now here I want to show you an image, not your kind of image, and it's this. This is just one little bit of finance. All I want you to look at is the curve, the growth curve here. So it goes from 201, right, under a trillion. You know what that is, right? A lot of zeros, more than billion, up to 62 trillion. Think of anything that can have that rate of growth in 6 years. I can't think of anything. Now, at the same time, can anybody think of anything or not? Maybe somebody. What? The plague. Yeah, that's a good. What? Creation of data. That's right. But anyhow, this is pretty, when you think of the items involved to go from less than a trillion to 62 trillion, that's quite impressive. You understand that, right? But anyhow, so here, these 62 trillion, I want to invite you to focus on this question of what is finance. It's a word that we use all the time, but it's a rather ambiguous term. These 62 trillion were more at that point than global GDP of all countries. Global GDP of all countries was 54 trillion, and that includes China, etc., right? You know what GDP is, right? Gross domestic product, basically the standard measure for the economy of a country. And at the same time, these 62 trillion were only 10% of the total value of finance in 2007, which at that point was 630 trillion, which is like 15 times global GDP. Now, I then ask myself, confronted with these kinds of figures, I ask myself, well, let me see how much actual currency as issued by central banks, exists in the world at that time. We can just take this time, this year. And again, I'm dying to ask you if anybody sort of knows, but it was much less than the value of total finance as measured by outstanding derivatives, which is the standard measure. It was about 250 trillion. Now, because it's national currency, it's always moving a bit, right? A bit of inflation, a bit less inflation. The central banks issues a bit more bank, etc. But it was significantly less. The difference between that actual currency and the value, the monetized value of finance, which is so much more, 630 trillion versus 250 trillion. That tells you something about a capability. Now, I want to take the extreme other case. I want to sort of illustrate how finance goes about invading other sectors and why it does it. What is it going after? So I'm going to take the almost opposite type of space from the space that is high finance, which is the space of modest, very, very modest neighborhoods with very, very modest homes. Now, the context is as follows, because it matters to understand that. The context is the top-level investors who have capital and they want to do something with that capital. They are telling the financial sector, please, I'm simplifying a complicated story now, you understand that, right? Please give us an instrument that has a real asset, something material involved in it. The typical word is asset-backed security. Why? Because at that point, the value, I repeat, of outstanding, the value of finance was so artificial that they're getting worried because they're not stupid up there, right? Now, in the case of the United States, and here, Wall Street was really ground zero for this innovation, which now has moved on in leaving sort of a path of destruction behind it. In the case of the United States, they had already financialized so much. Fancy real estate was financialized, etc., etc. Their used car loans, student loans, there was very little left that could be persuasive to high-level investors. Housing, always a safe bet because it's a material asset, because it might be in good, high-quality urban zone, etc., etc. The only houses left in the United States were very, 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 very modest. I mean, the only people without owning a house were very, very modest households. So there was a challenge. The challenge was, how do we, this is the financial sector, and by the way, I should backtrack. I want to give you an image. Goldman Sachs, we've all heard about, right? Goldman Sachs, the famous whatever, but it's just an example. Goldman Sachs had in what is called the back room. The back room is usually the space where the secretaries are and that kind of sort of staff. The back room had 100 physicists, because the math of high finance is a math of physics. It's algorithmic, it's open, you put in stuff, mix it up, out comes, something. It's the math of those who try to measure what cannot be measured. In other words, you have to construct an intermediation. It's amazing. Brilliant physicists. Now, I happen to think that physicists are great people. But once they're 30, they very often don't know what to do with themselves. I don't know if there is any of you here in the room. And so they wind up serving all these other sectors. I mean, this is a footnote now again. I think that if I can think of two forms of knowledge that mark the current period, it is physics and philosophy. And both of these can contain within them extraordinary openness without sacrificing complexity. It is a very interesting juxtaposition. We're quite used to having complex systems that are closed, and they can sort of create complexity because they're closed. This is a very different formulation. Anyhow, back to the story. So it took 16 steps, and I'll show you the results in a minute, 16 steps to transform a very, very modest house on which you have a mortgage into an instrument, into an asset that could be mixed up with enormously complex other elements, and then be sold in the high finance circuit for the benefit of high-level financiers. Now, so brilliant stuff to produce what turned out to be an elementary brutality. And so here, I just briefly, those of you who get it, you can very quickly read it, but I want to move on to the numbers, right? So the issue here was not to give people housing. The issue was sign the contract. Every one of those agents had to get about 500 contracts in a week signed. And they said, yeah, sign. For 5 years, you don't pay anything, and you can own a house. Now, all that was left in the United States at that point, not owning a house, was mostly very, very modest households. So all they needed was the contract to mix it up with high-grade debt and camouflage, that was part of the complexity, the low value of the asset. Truly an insidious instrument. Now, here's the result. And these are the data from the Central Bank of the United States. And this is a story that is now happening in Europe, too, and I'll show you. So what we really wind up with, and this is a category that I want to deploy here because I'm going to talk about other versions of urban land. Not city, not housing, urban land. So the result of all of this was empty urban land. Here are, every year, most of these people wind up being thrown out. A foreclosure is a notice, it can take years, but so that is every year. That's not cumulative. 1.2 million, 2.2 million, etc. The last figures are here, first half of 2004, another 500,000. Now, it winds up being about 14 million households. Here's another way of describing it. Here goes, the last 2013 here, you see, I don't know if you can see this well there. I'm missing 1.3 million, 1 million.3. Now, what I want to point out is that two things. 14 million households is about 30 million people. And the point that I want to make is that it's invisible in its full materiality. This is invisible for a whole series of reasons, nothing terribly rational. Now, secondly, I'll return to the question of its invisibility. Secondly, I sort of want to make Pythagorean this number, 30 million people. So I'm Dutch. My little country has a population of 16 million. That's half of the 30. It's as if a voice from above sort of says, all right, all of you on the territory of the Netherlands, out. Where you go, I don't know, but out. And now we're going to repeat the exercise. That is 30 million people. Now, in the United States, if you go to the outskirts, nobody goes there, to the outskirts of municipal, out of the city, let's say, out of the city, you have tent cities that look like the tent cities of the international refugee system. Blue, very neat. I have a video that I showed to my students, right, taken very, very early in the morning, and there are thousands and thousands of them in the United States. And again, they're invisible. Nobody sees them because nobody goes there. People may know, they may have relatives in there, etc. But again, I want to mark this question of this invisibility. That is my systemic edge, if you want. Now, so I show this video to my students, and nobody's out yet from those tents. So it looks very empty, terribly neat, lined up. These, again, do you have an image of these tents of the international refugee system? It's a certain kind of very bright, clean blue, And so I ask them, I stop the video and I say, who do you think is going to come out of there? Because you see that some people are, some of them are sort of moving a bit. And they usually think, they say, Latinos and blacks, African Americans. And out comes a blonde Anglo-looking guy with a beige pants, the opposite of the hood. The hood, you know what I mean, right? The sort of the dress of the hood. With a Lacoste or whatever it is, with a crocodile there or whatever, a bear, I don't know what it is. Right? And they can't believe their eyes. And this guy comes out and he says, yeah, look, I'm shaved, I'm clean, I'm ready for a job. He hasn't given up, as opposed to many black men who are, when they're 30, they have never held a job. At some point they accept no job. And this is a story that repeats itself. We are talking about millions of people who expected a middle-class life. There is that kind of expectation. And anyhow, the point that I don't want to lose in this is all that materiality, all those bodies, all that presence, invisible. People don't know about it. They have heard of some foreclosures, but they don't really understand what has happened. And it's not totally over yet. Now, here is what's happening in Europe. And I put Germany not on purpose there, but it's also happening in Germany. The worst is Hungary. Hungary now has a million households. These are households. We're not talking individuals. Now, Germany, by the way, this is not cumulative. This is every year. Now, Germany, we know they have the right algorithm for something in their economy, right? And mostly it is high-level manufacturing, machines that make machines. The whole world buys them in Germany, so to speak, machines that make machines. So Germany, look at this, and then you have Spain, United Kingdom, etc., etc. And then among the lowest are the so-called the nice countries, Denmark, the Netherlands. So the Netherlands is a bit less nice, they've gone a bit neoliberal there. So third or second, whatever I can't remember now, element. So this I called the other one empty urban land, right? All these houses, and you have vast numbers, you have millions of empty houses standing in the United States. And again, nobody goes there. They are invisible, like even in New York, invisible. So that is sort of the thing about when I said, we are theoretical the way we see. We don't see everything. Now, here is another process that is happening, and you must have heard, you live in London, you must have heard of this, which is the buying of land in cities. So I'm working with a data set of 100 cities that have become top recipients, 100 top recipients of foreign investment. No, of foreign and national investment, I correct that, in cities. And New York and London are at the top, etc. Now, here you just have a few figures. This is just for 1 year. And so you see New York received in 1 year 55 billion, which represents a growth of 10.9%, London, 47, a growth of 40%, you know, and so you go down, and some of these cities have significance, although I just show you a few here. Now, what I want to emphasize here is, again, the making of, in a way, empty urban land. So a couple of figures just to produce the sort of a bit of content. So this is just 1 year. This is something that takes off in this particular phase, because it is in many ways a very old history. As you know, if you live in London, you certainly know that. But it takes off after the crises. After the crises, land emerges. Land in the global south, I'll show you some figure on that, and land in the global north, which is mostly urban land, emerges as a very good investment. Because so much has been fictive capital, you know, derivative on an interest rate, creating another derivative. I mean, long chains. You know, that is why those investors were saying, give me an asset-backed security. Now, second point, when these are all, by the way, acquisitions where the minimum is $5 million. So we're not talking little nice homes. We're talking... And the typical investment is, of course, very significant, very large. The question is, what happens when a big buyer literally buys 2 or 3 blocks in a city, builds a mega project? What happens is a privatizing of urban land, of urban tissue, the little street, no more little street, the little square, the little messy corner, the little this. No, one big private, controlled, probably, not everybody can come in, project. So even if they build very densely, they're going to be de-urbanizing the city. If you think of the city, you know, as something that has a lot of substantive meaning, an office park is not a city. An office park is a high density, but it's not a city. So this notion that density is sort of, you have density, you have city, no. And for me, again, as a footnote now, I think of the city as a complex but incomplete space. And in that sort of mixture of complexity and incompleteness lies the capacity of cities to outlive many far more powerful systems that were, however, closed, formalized, etc. Whether it's big firms, look how many corporations have died. You know, kingdoms, republics, for entities, in other words, with far more power than a city, which is this ambiguous space, right? So to me, it matters a lot. The powerless, also in that context, get to make a history. Think of immigrant communities, make an economy, make a culture. They are not going to make a history in an office park, the powerless, because that is something, you know, you go there, you work, and then you're out. I don't know if office park means something here, but it is a lot of offices, privately controlled. Now, here is sort of an image that gives you a sense, you know, so that then it has the 100, you know, they sort of bubble at this level. But again, this is a story that I'm just giving you annual 1 year, and it starts a few years ago. And then here you have foreign investment. So when it comes to foreign investment, London is the top ranked. The thing changes. Now, I frankly think that whether it's foreign investment or national investment is quite secondary. The issue is corporate investment. Now, little footnote, I'm sure that some of you at least heard this. You know that actually, I want to use this case to illustrate that we cannot reduce this process to gentrification. Many people say, oh, there's gentrification. Well, sure, there might also be gentrification. This is a much deeper process, this buying up of urban land. Now, let me give you one again, the footnote. The Royal Qatari household, you know what I'm talking about, Qatar? They own more of London land than the Queen of England. I love that story. That story tells you that gentrification is not enough as of a category. You know, it's very common among urbanists to think, yeah, that's gentrification. It is also that, but it is also something deeper. And the image that I want to leave you with is the buying of urban land. Now, the urban land that they buy does not necessarily immediately get developed. You know, it's sort of an ambiguous, it's also a holding operation. Now, oopsie, what am I doing? This is, didn't we already see this? Okay. Now, other element that is a critical feature of the current period, and I call it the bridge into even the most modest household. And that has to do also with finance. Now, the bridge, what do you think is the bridge? How does a powerful sector like finance enter any household, even the most modest household? You think high finance, nothing to do with modest little households. Can you imagine what it is or not? Yes, debt. But insurance hangs in there too. But it's debt. So you don't get terrorized at all the numbers. Huh? They are very simple numbers, but I just want you to look at two little numbers here. So take Hungary, you see there? Well, no, first we're going to look at the title. Ratio of household credit to personal disposable income. This is the IMF staff papers. This is great research that is done in the IMF that never gets published, so they call it staff papers. That's one of my favorite digs. I go digging there. And I recommend it to anybody who's interested, because so this is all that kind of data. It's not my invented numbers. Now look at credit. Huh? Credit sounds very pretty. It's debt. You know that. It has a way of transforming. You say, credit, I have credit, I can spend it. Yeah, you can, but at a cost. Now then here, this is a crucial history. Huh? These 5 years, this is a period, the 2000s, where a lot of this stuff begins to happen. Now look at this. So this debt of Hungary, let's take Hungary, in 2000 is 11%. Incredibly modest. The Germans, always a safe, sort of indicator, 70%. That's a very reasonable debt to have, because there might be a period when a household really wants to invest. The United States, on the other hand, was already over 100%. That's not so admirable, I would say. And 5 years later, this debt is up to almost 40%. That is not good. Now, the United States then is up to 130, but this growth rate, same with the Czech Republic, is much higher. I don't have the UK here. Now, look at Germany. They don't budge. Look at that. I mean, it almost, for me, this is the stuff of a comic opera. I understand that not many of you can see that point, but now Spain, reflecting its crisis, 66, very good. It doubles it, 112. So the debt is just a little bit. The key thing the point I want to make, it is a bridge into your home by potentially very powerful lenders. Now, the question for me when I see this kind of data is, who owns that household debt? If a little local bank, a credit union, owes your household debt, chances are the capacity that you as a household have to pay interest, which is the profit for the little bank, recirculates in the town. So it adds to a collective growth, if you want, a collective good, That is why I'm totally, by the way, this is a footnote, against franchises. Every franchise, some of the franchises we must have, but we don't need a Starbucks. Huh? A mom and pop shop is better, because a franchise inevitably takes part of the consumption power of a locality out of that locality. It goes to corporate headquarters, who knows where they invested, right? So the this is one of my big sort of political things, the localizing of bits and pieces of the economy. Now back to the main story here. So I asked myself, who owns this debt? I went back to the IMF staff papers and look at this. Hungary, 40% of that debt is owned by foreign banks, and they're mostly Austrian, Swiss, and German. For once, the Americans are not the baddies. Now, that means that 40% of that capacity leaves. It leaves probably Hungary. It goes, and who knows where those other banks. That is not good. So debt per se is not bad, but when debt is in the hands of large corporates, chances are your locality is going to lose. Now, in contrast to all this stuff, these losses, here we go and look briefly at the top. And what you see is that they really can't lose. It doesn't matter what happens, but the trillions that are way beyond what is actual currency. Now look at this curve. This is the United States, admittedly exhibit number 1. Huh? So it's not that nothing was happening here, but let's just, But here, so this is the crises, which this is corporate profits, right? So those corporate profits indeed fall. It reflects the crisis. It lasts about 2 hours, huh? And then they're back up making more money than ever. I should say this is 2 years, not 2 hours. I was just making a joke there. But suddenly I realized in this audience you might have thought, oh, only 2 hours. No, it did last a bit more than that. And then this is corporate assets. Here you don't even see the crises. And there's a little like 30 seconds right there, something there. Sort of. And then it goes on. And so it's both the briefness of the impact, but the most important fact is more profits, more. It's like the crises, specifically the way in which it was handled by those who had decision-making power, actually enabled even more profit making, even more assets. Very disturbing. In the meantime, remember all the negatives that I've shown you, right? Now, here's another thing this is another part of this picture, right? So this is 1979, no, what is it? No, 1979, right, 1980 census as it's called. And then it goes actually up to the 2009 figures, right, for the American census. Look at the top 1%, 281%, the blah, blah, all of that. Look, 40%, no change. And this was invisible. What was visible was this in the form of their gentrification does apply, in the form of rebuilt cities, luxury housing, luxury hotels. The visual order, especially in global cities, captures this, all of this. And this, invisible. So the image that I always like to convey here. Now the United States, by the way, I'm interrupting myself, but the United States is probably the extreme version of what has been happening in many countries, including France, including Denmark, including Netherlands. Now, my image of this the invisibility of this is you go to a modest middle class neighborhood, the same little facades. The story is what is happening behind those facades, doubling up, impoverishment, etc., right? And the other story is, of course, those who wind up in homeless camps. For instance, in the United States, and they have just dismantled it, after the crisis of 2008, the biggest encampment of homeless people, and it was a new encampment, was, guess where? Where do you think? In the United States. Any idea? No ideas. Mostly you have had, somebody has had an answer. Mostly right. Yeah, good. California, this is a good crowd. California, but where in California? No? Silicon Valley. So if you stand, Silicon Valley is very pretty. It's a valley, you know, so it has low and high points, right? So if you stand on the high point, it's a lot of green. If you stand on the high point, all you see, and I have a video of that too, all you see is this beautiful, long, sloping hill and all the trees. If you arrive at it from the bottom, you see the encampment of the homeless. Now, I sort of was very interested in the following fact. They have cloth, you know, the typical homeless, you know, in a little bit of sort of wood. So they had great sneakers. They were mostly white. Great sneakers and great bikes. Now these were high-tech workers to a very large extent who thought everything was going to go fine. They were not the top, you know. And so they had probably taken loans. Many of them did, but I don't know if all. And they thought they could own a house, etc., put in a lot of their money. You know, that mid-sector doesn't make that much money. And so it fails, right? They have a mortgage and they're thrown out of their houses. And they assemble, at least many of them assembled, in this homeless camp. And so they have these, you know, sneakers. Okay, you keep your good sneakers. What are you going to do with it, right? You need them. And a bike, because in California you can't do without wheels. And so a bike is 2 wheels, and those are good wheels. But that tells you a story. That was the biggest encampment. And now they have broken it up. the authorities, because it is really a blemish, you know, on Silicon Valley with all its. So anyhow, these are also sort of a lot of these invisible stories. Now, this is one of these graphs where I just, you know, this is the question of wealth. You see, ratio of 1% wealth to median wealth, not the poorest. And after the crises, it goes up. That is why I wanted to. You know, it keeps growing, but look at this. I mean, and so I have made a whole, but this is not for this talk, a whole analysis. How did we solve the crises in such a mode that we generated extraordinary divergence? And the UK is a bit that way too. Now I want to move, now I have to really start moving, and if nobody tells me to stop talking, I'm going to be talking here till tomorrow morning, and some of you respectful people might still be sitting there with me. Now, in the shadows of urbanization, so you have all heard the phrase, which I don't want to utter, but I have to utter it for the sake. Most people live in cities. I am so tired of politicians who don't know anything about anything uttering that. So that was to me a provocation, and I said, okay, I'm going to play with urbanization. What don't I see when I invoke urbanization? So in the shadows. So one item is all these land grabs in the global south. I'm going to move very fast. A whole new history, 220 million hectares. Financial firms bought land, hedge funds bought land in the global south. This is all after the crisis, okay, or 2008. Here you have some of the graphs. Look at the bigger the yellow figures. These are different measures. Europe hangs in there too, but these are it only counts properties that are over 200 hectares. So Europe doesn't have that many of those. But in France, for instance, many of the young descendants of farmers now want to go back to farming. This is actually something that I've been tracking, and because, you know, the job market is not very good. They can't find land to buy because it's been bought up by corporates. By the way, here in the UK, in Cambridgeshire, you have foreign owners, foreign buyers of land, rural land. In the north, you know the owner of this famous HMS, something like that, the nice Swedish firm? Nice firm, you know, environmentally. He, very nice guy, by the way, has just bought a huge patch of land. I mean, huge, in the north of England, England proper. So it is also really arriving in Europe, but it's mostly in the global south. Now, there are other issues. Most of it is for industrial crops, so it means that they can put as many pesticides as they want in the earth because it's not a food crop, so that has enormous shadow effect. Now, I want to continue. So there was going to be more land grabbing because much land is dying. Here are all areas, including the Midwest. So the Midwest, the breadbasket of the world, as they like to call it in the United States. When you look at it sort of in the crop time, whatever, you know, the spring, I guess, it looks green, green, green. They put so many pesticides and I don't know what all fertilizers. But in fact, the scientists have established that the land is getting hot, hot, hot. It's dying. And the United States is on this map. This is made by scientists. Okay, doesn't matter. I already told you what it was, right? So now I just want to move on. I want to ask you so we're switching subject. I'm just talking fast now. I hope you're still with me. Did I confuse some of you? Okay, I guess not. So who has seen this map? Nobody? Okay, well, I'm sure that with those red dots that are up there, they have a lot of data about at least some of you who spend time in the United States. So this is a map, as you can see at the top. It's in the public domain, by the way. It's a map of government and private security agencies in the United States. 10,000. The logic, invisible, because when you're standing in front of those buildings, you don't know what is in there. It could be anything. Most of them are also privately owned firms paid by the citizens. Added irony. The logic of this is national. We're talking national security, right? So the logic of the system is that for our security, we the citizens first have to be suspect. So they gather data, which if something happens, they can then survey. Now, that's a very peculiar logic, you understand. and one is really tempted to ask oneself, who gains? We the citizens, it's not clear that we gain if we first have to be considered suspect, given the, everybody is. There's data. If you've been in the United States for 2 days, the machines have gathered data about you, almost sure, especially if you were online or anything like that. The tech companies and the construction companies, they gain. But I don't think the citizens gain. So which leads me then to ask also a question, who are we the citizens? I've shown you a lot of negatives that are at the edge. They are extreme conditions. Most of our daily life, etc., lives in a very normalized space, familiar normalized space. But when you go at that edge, where the extreme condition also becomes invisible, then you begin to see a lot of stuff that is truly extreme and that shouldn't be happening. And this is one of those. A lot of people, this is a map that has been in the public domain for a long time. And it should be a very familiar sort of thing. Now here's just an example of this building. Look at this. They're building, this is just for Washington, D.C., about 17 million square feet, the equivalent, I love this, of 3 Pentagons. The Pentagon is huge. And 22 U.S. Capitol buildings. This is just in D.C. that they're finishing building. Now the U.S. Capitol is the house of democracy in the United States. You can see the irony there. Now, here are some items, and I should say that you probably know this, but I would be really interested in finding out that if you don't know this, that the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, most European countries have declared, a while ago, a decade ago probably, a mini state of security, a state of exception, a partial state of exception. When a state does that, it enables itself to violate its own law. And that is what makes this possible. And I'm going to show you another list. Now here are, for instance, for the United States, if you see, some of the funding, but this is what a vast amount of money, 52.6 billion, while we're cutting food stamps for the poor, we're cutting all kinds of things. Now, I found this very interesting, and targets 5 objectives, warning U.S. leaders about critical events. 20 billion? Can't they just make a quick telephone call? I'll lend them my mobile. I don't have a mobile, actually. But combating terrorism, 72. Okay. Stopping spread of illicit weapons. I wish this were most of it, clearly, right? Conducting cyber operations, defending against foreign espionage. Anyhow, this is ridiculous. But the other thing, by the way, this is a very interesting map that the ACLU has set up, when you can read the title, right? Of incidents where individuals, groups' First Amendment rights have been infringed upon. Now, the United States is exhibit number 1 for all of this. It's extraordinary what is happening. Did anybody attend the session on extradition that we did at the London School of Economics about a month ago? A lot of very interesting data. Now, I want to show you something else. Here is another one. Who's dangerous? This is all extract. This is in the public domain, huh? But thank you, Mr. Snowden also, that kind of public domain. So the Department of Homeland Security issued warnings against, who's dangerous? Veterans. We're talking people who have sacrificed their life, probably lost a leg. Right-wing extremists, might recruit and radicalize disgruntled military veterans. Environmentalists, dangerous, mainstream organizations with known or possible links to eco-terrorism. And the Nation of Islam is a reasonable proposition. Now, then it goes on, but then I want to show you, not to read, but just to get a sense of the magnitude of it. So this is what we know the NSA, that's the National Security Agency, can do in terms of espionage on people so far. And I need to thank Jody Avignon and, of course, Snowden's documents. But it's in public domain. So here, just take any of these. It's ridiculous. So this is everything that it can do. It can, for instance, here, it can map your social networks. It can access your smartphone app data. It can hack into the UN video conferencing system. I'm just taking a few. Here's another one. It can remotely access a computer by setting up a fake wireless connection. By the way, people who think that their computer, like I have a computer that is not online at all where I write, it's to protect myself from, regular hackers. But they can actually access, NSA, that means also your security agency, Ken here in Britain, can access also your materials on a computer that is not at all connected to the internet via radio, that is somewhere here listed. So you keep on reading, right? And I love this one. Look at this. It can monitor online behavior through free Wi-Fi at Canadian airports. Just what we need, right? I mean, it is just... Facebook likes, just anything goes, and there is yet another page, and anyhow, it can harvest, images. This sort of, So it is an extraordinary, and Europe, by the way, this had just happened. I'm again very curious to know if anybody of you know. A new European Commission counter-terror plan will require it's been approved, the blanket collection and storage for up to 5 years of personal data records of all passengers flying in and out of Europe. This, at the same time, breaches the recent Court of Justice European. You read it, right? I don't want to dwell. So I want to end now and sort of end up with this notion of, given all these negatives, who are we? And when I say who are we, the citizens, I don't mean it as citizens versus immigrants. I mean it as we, residents of a place, of a country. When we are, for our security, first suspect, who are we? Now, I should tell, and this is a final note that I want to say, one of my projects, it's gone on for quite a while, is to look at all the rights we are losing. And I want to end with a short little story that involves my husband. My husband thinks that I work too hard and that I should have a hobby. I grew up in Latin America, where hobby is really not an operative term, it's sort of hobby. What is a hobby? But in 1996, President Clinton had passed a new immigration law. And in that immigration law was a clause that people who were citizens thought, why do I care about that? But it actually concerned citizens, because we were robbed from a right. They canceled a right, our right to take the immigration authority to a regular court. So there you don't need a judge approving, you can take it to a court. And that was eliminated, but in the context of an immigration act, well, that put me on the alert that, wow, we're losing rights. So I've been looking at this story of we're losing rights, since 1996. That's when it started. So I went back to Richard back then, and I said, Richard, I have a hobby. I'm counting all the rights we're losing. And he said, that's not a hobby, Saskia. Anyhow, thank you very much. So maybe it's too late. Maybe I should just, do we take some questions or?
Thank you so much, Saskia, for this incredible talk. We are really honored to have you speaking to us.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Hello, thank you. I was wondering, to what extent do you think the emergence of global finance was possible through the internet, through moving data quickly back and forth and stuff? And the other question, what stops us from writing Greek debt off? This money doesn't anyone seem to miss except maybe the Greek people.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
So it must be said that finance is a very old practice. So the Jews in a part of the ghetto in Venice, they were connected with the Jews in Frankfurt, who started sort of, now that's between banking and finance, etc. Speculative, the black tulip crisis in Amsterdam way back when. So finance as a speculative endeavor, really rose already in the good old European imperial, when there was a lot of trading, and in that trading was the possibility of creating added value by speculating. But then there comes an epoch, the Keynesian period, when it's sort of that kind of very speculative finance is cancelled. Derivatives become illegal. In Chicago, they didn't become legal again until 1973. Chicago is sort of one of the main financial markets for derivatives, of a certain type of derivative at least. So one cannot say that the internet, but what you need is that sort of, if you want, a condition, a constraint, a desire, an aim of invading something else, so the making of particular kinds of instruments, it really is the making of bridges, they are either fancy bridges or very elementary bridges. What happens today is that the speed enables extraordinary volumes, and the fact that you can digitize a lot of the algorithmic, once you have the elements, means that you can actually multiply the kinds of instruments, So digitization is like a godsend for this kind of finance. And so right now it's over a quadrillion, the value. I mean, do you know how many zeros that is? Does anybody have an idea? That's a lot of zeros, and all on the right side, right? It's more than 1 trillion. I mean, there is no way, that has no connection with currency, as I was saying. Now, Greece. So I've written quite a bit about this question of Greece, and I like to bring up with this kind of question that the IMF and the World Bank developed a whole series of instruments that were going to help Global South economies. And they said it will work. It was the equivalent of our austerity programs, only they called it restructuring programs. I find the language also interesting. In Europe, we call it austerity, the moral, we must. They're restructuring, you're doing it all wrong, you have to change, etc. So but really very, very similar entities. In 1997, the IMF recognizes that what it expected was not going to work for 46 countries. And they changed the contracts. So when I hear the Troika, you know what I'm saying, right? Today say, we can't change Schäuble. A contract is a contract is a contract. Come on, what are you telling me? Now, the discussion has turned nasty. I don't know if anybody, I'm following this, I think that for a moment there, Lagarde says, who's very intelligent, but who got as far as she did because she is extremely astute. So even like a few days ago, when it looked like the Greek government was going to have its way a bit more than right now, she says, we will work with Greece. Even as Schäuble is saying, the contract, she says, we will work with Greece, which is a very ambiguous term, but it signals we will. We will bring. Carney, the head of the UK central bank, one of the most important central banks in the world, you understand, declares, he's a Canadian, by the way, he says, austerity politics in Europe has not worked. That is a very radical statement. So you have this weird conjuncture. Well, right now, the Germans are ascendant. I shouldn't say the Germans, I should say the German position is ascendant. Now, I think that the leadership in Greece has it right, and Podemos is the same thing in Spain, right? I hope that everybody's interested in this. These are histories in the making. And so they both have a very clear, I think, analysis that starts from another ground. What's the point of punishing, destroying bits and pieces, big hunks, actually, of these economies? For what? To pay rich banks? You understand that most of the money that went from the Troika to Greece never went to Greece. It went straight to the banks, rich banks, financial banks. I mean, this is absolutely a scandal. So when the story that I was saying, all these people in tent cities, all these empty houses, all that misery, you stand back and you say, how can a system sort of explain this away? How can they say, yeah, you are out, go, I don't know where you go, but out. And then you have vast stretches of empty suburban space, or or in New York, not even so suburban. Very strange. So anyhow, I believe that at the core of the Greek effort lies what needs to be done, which is that instead of cutting off bits and pieces of the body of that Greek economy and that Greek social body, if you want, the need to actually make the economy work. And my sort of little thingy is the need to relocalize. Wherever we can relocalize bits of the economy, we relocalize them. Everybody who has entrepreneurial talent should be working at that. The state should enable that. Now, I'm at risk of giving a second talk, you've understood, right? I really care about this a lot, so I'm very glad for that question. All right, yes. Ah.
It seemed that it's also somehow about the dematerialization of assets. And if you look at, if you think about capital in itself, where it was once backed by gold, and then they abolished the gold standard, and then they could just print money freely, and then slowly this digitization of currency and debt to enormous forms of, as you have pinpointed. So I wonder if it is this dematerialization of asset that's also somehow creating this. And you also mentioned the similarities between the global south and what's occurring now in Europe. And you mentioned the IMF, which is actually very interesting, I find, because often with the IMF they introduce certain policies such as, and one of the big ones is the devaluing of your currency, the second one being the privatization of many public institutions, schools, educations, hospitals.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the global south was somehow maybe a prototype of sorts, and of course you could maybe elaborate in this further, and this movement between a hybridization of public and private sectors.
Yeah.
So what was once public now going privatized, and this being outsourced, and thus this notion of finance thus getting into these sectors as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You have said a lot of things, and I agree with all. So I think that, well, first just to put it on the table again and very clearly, that the restructuring programs of the Global South are really the equivalent of today's austerity programs in the Global North. And when you stand back and you ask yourself, so what do they change, these programs? They really open ground for the corporate sector. It's not just finance. I am focused a lot on finance. It's for the corporatizing of economies. And that is why all that investment, what matters is not that it's foreign or national, but that it's corporate. So now, when we have extraordinary data. I have a lot of that stuff. By the way, I brought this little book, my Expulsions book, which is going to be translated into about 20 languages. So if anybody has a problem with English, you still can read it. I just want to assure you. But here I have a lot of that stuff. So, there are millions of corporations, but there's a very limited number. The biggest way, when you include, say, corporations from Asia, etc., it's 3,000 plus firms out of millions of corporations. They have such command, direct or indirect, over, in Spanish we might say el patrimonio global, the global sort of the wealth that we have. And that is, of course, very, very disturbing. And so there are so many little micro histories that I would love to mention. But for instance, I just want to give you an example, because there is a lot of cultural work that happens here. So Davos, the famous, etc., where it's organized by corporations. They invite presidents and such, and some academics for entertainment, basically, right? And the notion always is that, and it's a fantastic, whatever. The notion is that it is about making deals. It's far more dangerous than that. And it's only dangerous at certain strategic conjunctures. So when I was invited to be a fellow, I went to do my field work. And at that point it was, in the late 90s, the notion that we have to educate government elites, media elites, and corporate elites in most countries in the world, because they wanted nothing to do with globalization, with deregulation, with privatization, because they're not stupid. They knew what was coming. The cultural work that got done there produced this argument for your own good. Open up, you'll get wealthier, when then it proceeded to destroy, I don't know how many. Now, in the last few years, a lot of people were saying nothing happening with Davos. This last meeting, in my view, was a dangerous one again. Inequality is the category that needs to be discussed, that needs to be addressed, etc. They needed, in Davos, the key cultural work that had to get done was, how do we sort of tame, domar, you know what I mean? Make a savage animal, an animal that could get out of control, which is getting a bit out of control from there. How do we make it, how do we produce a narrative? When I look at what's happening with Greece and the Troika is fighting not just because of Greece. It's fighting for an interpretation, for a narrative, for a rationalization, which is if you do this, this, and this, you pay your debts to the banks. Yeah, you destroy a third of your economy, doesn't matter, but you pay, then you're fine, you are a member. So this is why I think, and Podemos, I don't know if anybody here from Spain, but Podemos is very interesting. But they are also. So there is a lot of stuff that is happening. And to me, it's sort of really interesting to see how narrating becomes a critical tool, explaining away the whatever. One might stand back and say, with sobriety, say, why are we doing this? Why do we throw people out of their homes? And then we, the taxpayers, get to pay the blue tents, and whatever. There are so many irrationalities. Anyhow, it's another lecture. Yeah.
You sort of seamlessly transitioned from financial disparity to national defense spending, and
seamlessly I took a jump.
Oh, seamlessly with a jump.
Yeah,
So, but I'm sort of curious because one of the slides that you showed is that from 2007 to the present, the growth of the 1% was significantly enhanced.
Yeah.
So what that seems to suggest is that in financial good times and in crisis, money is able to be made. So that sort of asks the question, aside from...
Money is a big word here.
Right. So aside from the military-industrial complex influence of the United States, what would account for the growth in spending for national defense?
Accounts for the growth in national financial defense? Well, I think that the defense is pretty important. The other one is the whole high-tech bit. Those 10,000 buildings that I showed, they employ, just counting, top secret clearance, top like that. Snowden comes out of that too, only his was in Hawaii. But the building, not his building, the building where he's working. But they employ 1 million just the absolutely top secret clearance, and then there is a whole vast. Now, when I said it in passing, when I asked who benefits from that huge apparatus of 10,000 buildings that starts from, we need data about everybody just in case. What kind of a logic is that? Instead of old-fashioned, what was it, intelligence gathering and espionage, they don't know how to do that anymore in the US. So the answer to the question, who benefits from this version of working towards national security, I think is the high-tech sector. This is a dream. Now, a lot of this probably falls under some of these special Pentagon, Homeland Security, etc. budgets. But look, the United States is an extraordinarily rich country, partly because it is large, and there is a vast amount of money that for a very long time has gone into the industrial defense complex, right? Now we can add this whole high-tech sector. It always has been in there, but now on a scale that is enormous. If we add the drones and all of the kind of new military technology, it's huge. So a lot of the money goes there. And a lot of it has also gone to the banks, something that I didn't talk about, which was also sort of a horrible story, actually. So when the crisis hits the United States, just to give an example of where this money all goes, because most of it is taxpayers' money. It used to be that it was more 45% versus 55% corporate taxes. Now corporate taxes are like 30%, 25%. The rest is all taxpayers, the citizens, so to speak. So when the crisis hits, there is a huge debate in Congress, in the legislature, about helping the banks out with $320 billion. Huge public debate, everybody talking about it. In the meantime, and we only found out through Freedom of Information Act, it took 2 years, strictly speaking, 7 trillion were passed on to the global banking system, 21,000 plus requests, French banks, German banks, Swiss banks, rescuing the global banking system. That was citizens' money. And then we added another 10 trillion in the form of quantitative easing. And they give it these amazing terms, quantitative easing. Doesn't it sound beautiful? Quantitative easing, it's just taking the cash, and they were doing it secretly. This is a very dubious liberal state. The liberal state probably has always been a bit dubious, but now it is highly. So anyhow, so there is so much money that is flowing into particular sectors, you know, but you named two, and I would add the high tech. People, do we think that maybe the time has come to call it an evening, or is there an...
Can I ask one more?
Oh, yes, absolutely, of course.
Up here.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back, actually, to the idea about seeing theoretically.
Yeah.
And I'm reading a really fantastic book at the moment by Annie Dillard, and she won the 1975 Pulitzer Prize for a book called Tinker at Pilgrim's Creek.
Oh, right,
and
right.
I
Is
don't know
that
if you've
like
read
a
it,
novel, or...?
No, it's actually a book about kind of seeing and philosophy and nature. But one thing she talks about is how we see, and how we see selectively, and how we see selectively for a number of different reasons. It might be because things are camouflaged. It might be because obviously our mind has to select what we're looking at in terms of focus.
That is the critical, right.
And there's one really interesting phrase that I'm going to paraphrase, and I just wondered if you could comment on it, where she says, as soon as you can forget the natural obvious and construct an artificial obvious, then you too will see invisibility. I'm going to put it at the end of that sentence. And I wondered if you thought that was a useful way of thinking. Obviously, you've shown us artificial obvious in graphs and charts, maybe, could be one interpretation. But I'm not quite sure, you know, how to read those words.
No, but I think I understand what you're saying. And I think that's right. I think that when I say it's invisible given certain categories, you know. So that for me, the clearest formulation of that, very, very sort of elementary, is that the long-term unemployed, at some time, at some point, fall out of our statistical categories. We don't see them. We don't see them statistically. You know, this is a very... And the evidence is all over. They're just lost. So they're there, but they're not counted. You know, so that is just a very simple example. And that, of course, means we have to change something in our categories. Now, when I talk about categories for analysis, that's another level from the sort of deeper notion that we must eliminate all kinds of things. Otherwise, we would go crazy. You know, if I just saw everything, I would be so engaged here for at least, I don't know, 20 minutes. You know, it just would be paralyzing. So, and to call it teoria is because I bring in theory because it is, you know, and I love this Greek word theoria, seeing, but seeing in a way that not the way the eye sees, but, you know, some other mix. So, but that's a very nice, I'm going to remember that reference. But I do think, I mean, what I didn't talk much about today was I have this whole other spiel in the book, which is about dead land and dead water, and how that also becomes invisible. You know, that we're literally expelling bits and pieces of the biosphere out of its life space. That was a chapter that got me most going. It's the biggest chapter in the book. And so I argue, dead land, we made it, we should make it a jurisdiction. A jurisdiction is a way in which a formalized system recognizes the existence of X, you know, and gives it a name, gives it a system of authority, so to say, rather than disappearing it. I want to see the map of the United States with the breadbasket of the world, the Midwest, with big patches of dead land. And I say in kindergarten, kids should learn, and the teacher should say, yeah, your mommy and your daddy helped make that dead land, you know, and there again, the we is in our biggest. But I really believe in, I've been doing that for a very long time. My analytic tactics, I have had them. So the global city is a good example, a familiar example. The city, global, when I first came out with that word, people said, that doesn't make sense, your English is failing you. And I said, I know what I'm doing. The city, you know, belongs in a hierarchy. And I say the global city, it's an invitation to see something that otherwise, you know, you say, oh, the national state, so stuff like that, you know. I do this all the time, but it is interesting when you think, and you are artists, you know, you can work much more with this kind of notion that we are theoretical seers. This is very intriguing. And I always think of art actually as making visible something that otherwise we don't see. A minimalism, even a blank canvas presented as art. Hey, it's making visible something, you know. So anyhow, was that a good last question? Do we think, or?
Thank you.
Oh, you have a okay.
I'm just thinking. Your whole talk is. If I think of where, let's say, Marx would be. If Marx was,
you don't think he would say, "There goes my girl"?
Absolutely, but I'm just thinking. Your talk is a provocation to some kind of response or some kind of. Traditionally, one would talk about revolution or some kind of radical change, but what you're presenting there is a kind of abstraction to the point where it's very difficult. And there was one moment where you were optimistic about an idea of complexity within community, which is a very small local
they're
idea
relocalizing. Right.
Against an idea of chains or corporations, or. Right. But I'm just thinking, really, in the face of all your data, which is what you know, and big data, that there is a. The result is a kind of a sense of powerlessness in terms of what can happen. And the idea that revolution on a national situation would also be powerless, whereas in the past, you know, you could argue an idea of restructuring. I
don't know. I think I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I can see, you know, who am I to know what? But I think that very often what I'm talking about, like, you know, I have these images in between, relocalizing bits and pieces of the economy. I give you an analytics that allows you to see, okay, this is very difficult to deal with. High finance, I didn't say my favorite phrase. Nobody can really govern high finance, but it is so powerful and violent that it can't govern itself either, so it brings itself down. Now, if we give it quantitative easing, it lives a bit longer, you know. But no, I'm actually saying that with different lenses, we can see possibilities. We can see the idiocy of the Troika insisting, no, we're going to fire all these people, we're going to destroy all these small businesses because we have to pay the banks. You know, on the contrary, I'm trying to make you see it's not reasonable. You're cutting off pieces, you know. I mean, so I don't agree with you. But then, you know, it's good for me to hear what you said.
Yeah,
rather than you telling me, you gave a great talk. I like that too. Yeah. But no. Yes. No, but I think that, you know, I mean, look, I can also get depressed, by the way, and feel that you know, it can, when you really, I mean, I really feel pain and anger at what is happening. And that includes the dead land, and it includes so many things. I say, how is it possible? You know, and a lot of this, we cannot control it. But what I also believe is in practices, just as an image. I love this story. I tracked them for a while. Now I've lost track. A whole bunch of high-tech types who in Spain, who lose their jobs, lose everything. They decide to go reoccupy one of these abandoned villages in the rural areas of Spain, which are they're tough, you know, not a lot of water, not a lot of green. It took them 2 years, but they were intelligent, and it was a project. They went several, you know, quite a group. It took them 2 years to fix it all up, to start growing. Then they started selling, and they're sort of loving it. Loving it is a light word here, not loving it, loving it, you know, because they are makers. And urban agriculture, you know, we see all of these little interventions. I mean, they're not going to change the system. There is a systematicity that is going to, I think, destroy itself, you know, and then who knows what comes next. I don't know that. But I am also worried about it when I'm talking about urban land. We need cities. We need cities because it really is a space where those without power make a history. If we lose cities, and cities, again, I repeat, it's not density. It's much more. So I I am not cheery, huh? But I am sort of, I don't know. I think that some of what I describe gives you at least an insight into. And in the end, we made it. You know, it's not some, like when Choyle says, contracts are not broken. I mean, what are they talking about? You know, you stand back and you see the 46 contracts that were changed in the Global South because it didn't work anymore. You know, I don't know. I think that knowledge of the inside of systems, and you know, it can be a tool. You know. All right. Thank you very much. Great question. And I brought 3 books for the library, so.